Hello, I'm Peter Singer, and almost 50 years ago I wrote this book, Animal Liberation. This is the first edition, published in 1975. And much more recently, I updated that book fully in a book called Animal Liberation Now, which presents my current views on this subject and also brings all the facts up to date. Obviously, a lot of things have changed about the treatment of animals since 1975, and that's one of the things that I want to talk to you about today. I'm doing this in connection with the issue of ETYKA that contains an article that I've co-authored with Professor Katarzyna de Lazari-Rudek about animals, and I'm also pleased to come back to writing about animals in ETYKA because I first wrote about animals for ETYKA in 1980. In fact, I found on my shelves this edition, volume 18, and I see my essay here, though translated into Polish, so I won't try to read the title to you because I'm sure my pronunciation would not be very attractive. But I do want to talk about the issues of how our treatment of animals and how things have changed both in the field of philosophy and to some extent, though not nearly enough, in practice about our treatment of animals. So going back to 1975 and to the views that I also expressed in that article in ETYKA, the basic philosophical principles that I put forward then, I continue to hold. The central idea of that is that it's wrong to think that membership of our species, Homo sapiens, being human in that sense, gives a being a special moral status that means that they are automatically, because of that species membership, of a higher moral status than other sentient beings who are not members of the species Homo sapien. That's a very common view, of course, widely held in ethics, that somehow there are such things as human rights that all human beings have and that no non-human animal has. And those human rights, on this view, entitle us to special protection, make our lives more sacred, or in a non-religious way you might say, make our lives inviolable, make it wrong to take our lives without our consent anyway, in a way that it's not wrong to take the lives of non-human animals, that it's also not wrong to do things that cause an immense amount of suffering to non-human animals, even when that is not necessary to save our lives or to prevent us experiencing a equal or greater amount of suffering. So that's what I'm opposing. I'm opposing the ethical view, as I said, that humans are somehow morally more important automatically because of our species membership than non-human animals, and I'm opposing the things we do to animals that are the result of that outlook. So firstly, why do I oppose the idea that moral status of humans is somehow automatically higher than that of non-human animals? I don't think that the boundary of a species is in itself morally relevant, any more than the boundary of a race or of a particular sex is morally relevant to how we ought to treat people. And in those particular areas, I think you will all agree with me. Very few people today would hold, for example, that being of the European race, insofar as we can define that, gives you a higher moral status than, let's say, being of African descent. And yet we only have to go back about 200 years, and of course that was the case. Europeans went to Africa, captured or bought Africans as slaves, transported them in horrendous conditions across the Atlantic, and sold them to work as slaves on the plantations of the New World. Similarly, we don't even have to go back 200 years to the idea that being male, being a man, was enough to give you a superior status to being female. Only men had the right to vote, for example, in democracies that gave people the right to vote. And there was often other legislation that made the position of men much stronger than that of women. For example, in the United Kingdom, married women could not own any property. Whatever property they might have had when they came into the marriage automatically became the property of their husband once they were married. So obviously their independence and prospects of leaving the marriage were made vastly more difficult because of that provision. So if we reject those things now, we see them as the ideology of a dominant, more powerful group, Europeans in one case, men in the other, using their power to exploit others and building up an ideology, a set of ideas, a set of ethical beliefs that justified them in what they were doing. And to that extent, I think there is a strong parallel with speciesism, which obviously makes the parallel with racism and sexism. So the humans as a species are more powerful than non-human animals because of our larger brains, greater cognitive abilities have enabled us to dominate them by developing technologies that enable us to overpower them, even though they're often physically stronger than we are. And following that, we have domesticated them, we have regarded them as items of food or as items to produce eggs or milk for us. We regard them as tools for research, to conduct experiments on. We kill them for their fur. We do many things to them which are clearly directly contrary to their interests, and most of those things I mentioned at least are not essential for our interests. The largest of these areas, of course, is raising animals for food, and that practice, if we just limit ourselves to vertebrate animals alone, we produce and raise something like 200 billion animals each year, and kill, I should add, too. And that doesn't even include wild-caught fish. So this is a vast industry which is conducted on the idea that these animals are ours to use, that their interests don't really matter. I think that this is not defensible, and I know some people have said, and in fact I just said a few moments ago, that humans are cleverer than animals, we have bigger brains, you could say we're more rational, we're able to think in a different way, plan for the future, and that's what gives us a higher moral status. Now that's not speciesism as such, because it's not referring to species. And as I said, what I think is clearly wrong is speciesism. But the practices and beliefs that I just referred to are based on speciesism. They're not based on our capacities to reason or to use language or to plan for the future. And we can see that from the fact that there are humans who are not more rational than some non-human animals, who do not plan for the future, do not use language, for example, as we are now, but we still give them a superior moral status to any non-human animal. Obviously, infants are one quite large category of humans in that situation, not smarter than animals. You could say they have the potential to be smarter than animals, and nearly all of them do, but some of them unfortunately don't. They may have a genetic abnormality, which means that they will never develop capacities to reason, or they may have suffered a massive brain injury, often very premature newborns suffer a hemorrhage in the brain, and that may have eliminated their capacity to think or reason or talk or plan for the future. But we don't then say, oh well, here's a human who lacks the moral status of other humans. We don't say, oh, here's a human we could do experiments on that would actually be often more useful than the experiments we do on non-human animals, because very often things that cure diseases in non-human animals do not cure the same diseases in humans. But we don't do experiments on them because we still say that they have rights and that they are superior to non-human animals. That's what I don't think we can defend or justify. So that's why I wrote Animal Liberation in 1975, that's why I wrote the article for ETYKA in 1980, and that's why I revived Animal Liberation to Animal Liberation now. But the fundamental ethical view that I put forward and that I just described remains. I have in Animal Liberation now extended some discussion to other issues, like how we should think about wild animals and the fact that there is a lot of suffering in nature that is not caused by humans, and whether we should intervene in nature for that reason. I've also talked more about which animals are sentient, because since 1975 there's been a lot of new research that I think establishes very clearly that fish are sentient beings. There were some people who challenged that earlier on, but I think there's very good research showing that fish can feel pain. Of course, fish covers a huge variety of species, far more species than mammals. So there are no doubt differences between different species of fish, but it seems to me that the likelihood is that they're all capable of feeling pain. And even some invertebrates, like octopus and some crustaceans like lobster or crabs, the evidence that they can feel pain too is now quite strong. So I think that with the greater confidence of the capacity to feel pain, we should be extending our concerns to all animals who may be able to feel pain. And depending on how much likelihood we give to that may be able to feel pain, that may even include insects, although of course what that requires us to do, given that it is sometimes quite difficult to live without controlling insects, that is still a further question to be discussed. Both in the original book and in the new book, I spend quite a lot of time examining the use of animals in research, and I spend quite a lot of time examining factory farming, the intensive rearing of animals. On the use of animals for research, I am not an absolutist. I am not saying it can never be justified or defended, but I do believe that many of the experiments that are conducted today are not justified because they are not doing anything that has sufficient likelihood of making a real difference to our well-being, whereas they do cause immense suffering for large numbers of non-human animals. But for details, I suggest you do look at Animal Liberation now for the more up-to-date account of experimentation. Similarly, factory farming, intensive farming, is an area that I see as the worst of things that we do to animals, because the scale, as I said, something like 200 billion animals raised for food, about something like 85 billion of them land animals, and the remainder fish raised in intensive aquaculture, which is really just factory farming underwater. So that's where my main concern is. If there's one thing that I would change, that I could stop, it would be factory farming as far as animals are concerned. And again, as I show in the book, there is an immense amount of suffering being inflicted on these animals. They are reared indoors in very crowded conditions. They've been bred to grow extremely fast, which causes them serious welfare problems. And none of this is necessary. It's all actually wasteful of food, because when we confine animals indoors, we have to grow food that we could eat, use good arable land to grow these crops, and then we get back from the animals maybe 1/10 of the food value in the case of cows, maybe 1/3 in the case of chickens, but always significantly less than the food value we put in. So it's not a way of feeding ourselves, it's actually a way of wasting food and making it harder to feed the world's population. There has been some progress in some parts of the world, and that area that I just mentioned, factory farming, is one of them in which the European Union has taken a lead. And I think the European Union has made significant progress in reducing some of the worst forms of factory farming, prohibiting, for example, the keeping of hens in small wire cages, maybe this big, and that's the total living space for 4 or 5 hens for their entire egg-laying lives. So that's prohibited in the European Union. The keeping of calves and of the mother pigs in individual stalls so narrow that they can't even turn around is also prohibited in the European Union. Those are significant steps forward, but not nearly enough, because all of these animals can still be kept indoors in very crowded conditions, conditions that do not give them a minimally decent life. So I think that doing philosophy should change our lives, and I think if we study the ethics of how we ought to treat animals, and we study how we are treating them, particularly in factory farms, then I think it becomes quite obvious that one change that we ought to make in our lives is we ought not to support factory farms, and the real way in which they need our support is they need our money. They need us to buy their products, otherwise obviously they're out of business. But we have the freedom to choose what to buy. We can nourish ourselves perfectly well without eating animals. I've been a vegetarian for 53 years now, and I feel I'm doing pretty well. And I've moved towards being vegan more recently than that. But we really don't need animal products, so you can do without them altogether. But even if you feel you do want to continue eating them sometimes, at a minimum I would say make sure that they are from animals who have lived outside in conditions that are suitable for their species and their needs. So this has been a short talk, but I would like to encourage you to look more deeply into the ethics of our treatment of animals. There's now a quite broad literature on it that you can go to. Some of my works have been translated into Polish. If you are a Polish speaker listening to this, Animal Liberation is in Polish, and I'm hoping that the new edition, Animal Liberation Now, will be in Polish before too many years pass. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure to return to the pages of ETYKA after 43 years, and it's terrific to know that the cause of concern for animals is alive in so many different countries in the world today, and I hope those of you interested in reducing suffering, irrespective of the species of the being who is suffering, will support those organizations working for a better life for animals. Thank you very much.